What if the prairie wind carried not only the whisper of wheat, but the groan of bones beneath the soil? In 1867, Kansas was still raw and untamed, a frontier carved by hunger, storms, and the aching weight of survival. There, in the endless flatlands where silence pressed harder than stone, stood a lonely inn. Its keepers, the Bender family, wore faces of civility by daylight, but when the storms came at night, travelers vanished, leaving only suspicion and soil darkened with secrets. What happens when the land itself remembers the screams that history tried to bury? Before we descend into this dreadful tale, linger with us. Subscribe to this channel and bind yourself to our circle of shadows. Here, forgotten histories rise again, stitched with bone, blood, and the silence of the damned. The Kansas plains in 1867 stretched outward like an endless shroud, a horizon stitched with silence and wind. Grass bent low under storms, and the soil bore the scent of hunger, sweat, and death. To many, this land was promise, a place where homesteads might grow from dust into legacy. But amidst this dream, there stood a house that did not belong to the light. The Bender cabin was built of rough planks and nailed with haste, its walls leaning slightly as though burdened by the weight of secrets. From a distance, it seemed harmless, a small refuge offering rest for travelers on weary trails. Yet those who approached felt the air thicken, as though the earth itself warned them away. Inside the cabin, shadows moved with the family. John S.R., with his coarse beard and guttural German mutters, carried an air of disdain for all who crossed his threshold. His wife, Elvira, pale, hollow-eyed, her silence sharp as broken glass, drifted through the rooms like a spirit more than flesh. Their son, John Jr., laughed often, but the sound was jagged, almost rehearsed, as if mocking the very notion of joy. And then there was Kate, young, beautiful, her voice a velvet snare. She spoke of healing, of spiritualism, of the unseen world, drawing the curious and the weary alike. Yet her gaze was not of salvation, but of hunger, the hunger of someone who saw in men not souls, but offerings. By daylight, the cabin's door opened to weary wanderers, offering bread, meat, and water. The scent of cooking filled the air, masking the faint iron tang that lingered in the cracks of the wood. Lanterns burned late into the night, their glow visible across the fields. The prairie folks spoke of the Benders' hospitality, but with words half-choked by unease. Horses refused to tether too close to the inn. Dogs bristled, growling at the threshold. And storms, those endless Midwestern tempests, seemed to twist around the cabin, breaking oddly, as though unwilling to cross its cursed ground. The house was more than a shelter, it was a snare. Within its walls, travelers were sized up not as guests, but as prey. The wooden boards absorbed their voices, the earth beneath drank their blood, and the prairie swallowed their names. The family lived in this rhythm of predation, a cycle hidden beneath polite smiles and bowls of stew. Each disappearance was a whisper in the town, yet no proof ever clung to the Benders' door. For years, suspicion hovered like a storm on the horizon, never breaking. But then, on one chill evening, a traveler rode into the yard with eyes that did not lower, a man carrying both coin and resolve. He accepted the Benders' food, but his gaze lingered too long on the trapdoor beneath the table, his ears too keen to ignore the shuffling silence that followed Kate's smile. And as the wind howled against the cabin walls, the balance that had protected the Benders for so long began to tremble. The prairie was stirring, and the house of bones would not keep its secrets much longer. The lantern flickered. A shadow moved. And in that moment, the first crack in the Benders' mask began to form. The Bender cabin glowed faintly at dusk, its lanterns swaying in the prairie wind as though warning signals in a sea of grass. Inside, the table was set with care. Coarse bread, steaming stew, strips of meat glistening in the dim light. For weary travelers, the meal seemed salvation, the promise of warmth against the bitter chill. Yet to sit at that table was to step into a ritual, each motion calculated, each smile a thread in the web. The chair of honor, always placed against the canvas curtain, seemed at first an act of hospitality, a place where the guest might enjoy warmth, food, and the company of the family. But behind that curtain stood the hammer, waiting in silence. It was not just a tool but an altar's weapon, the executioner's promise. When the meal began, Kate leaned forward, her eyes like dark lanterns, speaking of spirits that wandered between the living and the dead. Her voice lulled men into trust, coaxing them to speak of their pasts, their fortunes, their dreams. As they poured themselves out, John Jr. Laughter broke the air in jagged shards, circling them like a predator testing the boundaries of fear. The stew itself bore an odd scent, thick and metallic beneath the herbs, as though the iron of old blood had seeped into the broth. Yet hunger drove men to eat, and the prairie's endless miles left them too tired to question. Shadows stretched long against the walls, flickering as the lantern swayed. And then came the silence, the kind that seemed to lean in close, pressing against the ears until even the sound of one's breath felt intrusive. It was in that silence that the hammer fell. A swift arc, hidden by the curtain, splitting bone with a dull crack. The body slumped, life extinguished before the stew cooled. For a heartbeat, the room held only the sound of Kate's steady breath, and then the family moved as one. Elvira dragged the limp form by the boots, John Sr., lifting the trapdoor with a creak that groaned like a coffin hinge. Below yawned the pit, shallow and dark, its soil soaked through with the offerings of years. The body dropped into the maw with a muffled thud, bones striking bones, the weight of death settling into the earth once more. The lantern swayed, painting the walls in hues of blood and gold. Kate smoothed her dress, her eyes shining as if the act had only quickened her hunger. She returned to the table, poured wine into her glass, and drank slowly, as though in communion with the very silence she had summoned. Outside, the prairie stretched, unaware of the rituals that unfolded within the crooked walls. The wind rattled the boards, and in its voice one might have heard the groan of countless souls now bound to the soil beneath that cursed house. But the pit could not remain silent forever. With each body the earth grew restless, the weight of blood too heavy to bury. And far away in the town where letters went unanswered and wagons never returned, whispers began to coil like smoke. Whispers that would drift, grow, and one day crash like a storm upon the bender's door. The lantern's flame sputtered. A shadow flickered across Kate's face. And in the silence that followed, it seemed the earth itself had begun to listen. The Kansas prairie had always been a place where men disappeared, swallowed by storms, sickness, or silence. But by 1871, the absences were too many, too patterned, too precise. Merchants who rode with wagons heavy with goods never reached their destinations. Farmers traveling with coin for land deeds were never seen again. Preachers, trappers, wanderers, all had vanished after crossing that lonely stretch near the bender's homestead. Their horses returned riderless, their wagons abandoned, their names etched into silence. At first it was nothing more than murmurs in taverns, voices lowered to the rasp of suspicion. A letter unanswered, a promise unfulfilled. A trail that ended with no trace. Men spoke of curses, of the prairie claiming back what men had tried to tame. But beneath the superstition, fear had roots. Mothers clutched their children tighter, travelers rode faster, and eyes turned toward the Bender cabin with a kind of unease that left the air heavy as storm clouds. Kate Bender did not help ease their dread. She continued to preach her sermons of spiritualism, claiming to commune with the dead. Her words dripped with fire and hunger, promising healing but laced with shadows. Some whispered that her seances were more than performance, that she had bargained with something beyond, something that demanded flesh. Neighbors who once tolerated her strange beauty now spoke of her with a trembling bitterness. Even her laughter, soft and melodic, began to sound like the hiss of a snake in the ears of the wary. Still, proof was absent. The prairie offered no graves, no bones, no testimony beyond whispers. Authorities rode through, their boots crunching the earth near the Bender's orchard, but the family stood smiling at their door. John S.R. muttered in his thick German tongue, Elvira glared in silence, John Jr. laughed too loudly, and Kate charmed the air with talk of spirits and salvation. No accusation stuck, for suspicion without evidence was as light as smoke. And so the cabin stood, waiting, devouring, hiding. But the hunger of suspicion could not be quelled. Each name that disappeared was another stone upon the people's chest. Each unanswered letter was a thread unraveling trust. Then came George Newton Lonker, a widower seeking a new life with his young daughter. They vanished after passing through the Bender land, their absence striking the community like thunder. A man alone might be dismissed, but a father and a child swallowed whole by silence, that was a wound that could not be ignored. The whispers turned to shouts. Neighbors gathered in tight circles, voices trembling with rage. Storms rolled across the prairie, wind lashing homes like whips, but still the townsfolk spoke of the missing. Each gust of wind seemed to carry the names of the lost, each crack of thunder a demand for reckoning. And though the Benders' lanterns still glowed faintly each night, the world beyond their walls was changing. The patience of the town was fraying. The prairie had long tolerated silence, but now silence itself was beginning to break. And one night, under a bruised sky swollen with thunder, men vowed that the next disappearance would not be met with whispers, but with fire and steel. The storm broke the night they entered. The sky roared with black thunder, rain slashing the prairie like a whip of glass. A posse of townsfolk and lawmen rode hard toward the Bender cabin, their torches sputtering in the wind, their rifles slick with rain. They had heard too many names whispered into silence, too many promises drowned in shadows. And when George Newton Lonker and his infant daughter failed to return, the people's restraint shattered like brittle bone. The cabin greeted them with silence. Its walls leaned in the gale, boards rattling like teeth in a skull. Inside, dust clung to the air as though the family had fled in haste. Pots still sat on the stove, the faint scent of stew clinging to iron. A chair had toppled. The lanterns were gone. The Benders themselves had vanished into the storm, leaving only absence behind. But the silence was heavier than emptiness. It pulsed as though the house itself breathed secrets. They searched, boots thudding against warped floorboards. And then someone found it, the trapdoor. It groaned open with the sound of rotting wood splitting, and a stench rose up that silenced every voice in the room. It was the smell of iron, of rot, of earth too long married to blood. The pit yawned beneath them, shallow and dark, its soil clotted with blackened pools that still glistened in the torchlight. Men gagged, some swore, others whispered prayers through trembling lips. But the horror did not end there. Outside in the orchard they dug. Shovels bit into the wet ground, mud sucking at their boots. And one by one the graves revealed their truths. Bodies twisted in shallow earth, skulls cracked wide from hammer blows, throats slashed with surgical precision. Men who had vanished months before. Women, travelers, merchants. And there among them George Newton Lonker, his face broken, his body left to rot in silence. Beside him, wrapped in a filthy cloth, was the tiny corpse of his infant daughter. A silence fell so profound it seemed to smother even the storm. Some men wept openly. Others turned away, fists clenched until their nails drew blood. The orchard had become a garden of the damned. Its roots drank deep of suffering, its trees twisted from feeding on the marrow of men. The soil was black and fat with decay, as if mocking the promise of life it was meant to bear. Each grave unearthed became a sermon, a reminder that evil had not only walked among them, but smiled, broken bread, and offered warmth by the lantern's glow. When the men turned back to the cabin, their fury swelled like fire against dry wood. Yet their anger found no flesh, no blood to strike. The Benders were gone, vanished into the endless horizon, their wagon tracks already blurred by rain. All that remained was their house, a crooked skeleton of timber, a mausoleum of laughter and lies. The storm raged on, beating the land as if to cleanse it. But the pit still gaped open, the graves still whispered, and the shadows clung tight to the cabin walls. Justice had come too late. And as the rain washed blood back into the soil, the question rose louder than thunder. If the killers had escaped, where would they strike next? The discovery of the orchard spread like wildfire, burning across the Kansas prairie with the fury of 1,000 storms. Word carried on the wind into taverns, across church pews, through the trembling lips of mothers who had lost sons. America's first whispers of serial killers had a name now, the Benders. And though their cabin still sagged in the wind, hollow and abandoned, the killers themselves had dissolved into the horizon. The people would not allow it, not while the graves lay open, not while the prairie groaned with the weight of their sins. Men gathered in posses, rifles polished, torches raised, faces hardened by grief and rage. They rode into the vast expanse of the plains, following wagon tracks that cut through the mud like veins. The sky above was merciless, sometimes a blistering sun that baked the land until the air itself seemed to scream, sometimes storms that crashed with a vengeance, mud swallowing hooves and boots alike. Yet the hunt pressed forward, driven not by justice but by something darker, something primal. It was vengeance that urged their horses onward. Rumors swirled as swiftly as the prairie winds. Some claimed the benders split apart, scattering like crows to confuse their pursuers. Others said they fled north toward Missouri or farther west into the mountains, changing their names, disguising their faces. A few whispered that Kate, with her dark eyes and her witch's tongue, had conjured a veil of shadows, blinding the righteous, twisting the trail into nothingness. Elvira, they said, could call storms to cover their escape, while John S.R. walked the night as a beast, a figure of dread beyond human flesh. The prairie was wide enough for myth to grow as fast as fury, and each mile made the line between truth and legend blur. Rewards were posted, posters nailed to walls that already sagged beneath the weight of grief. Every town, every outpost became a stage of suspicion. Strangers were eyed with venom. Families traveling alone were stopped, questioned, their names demanded like confessions. Some swore they had seen the benders in Missouri. Others insisted they were captured and lynched in secret by vigilantes. Yet no body was ever displayed, no justice ever confirmed. The killers lived on, if not in flesh, then in fear. And still the earth gave up its secrets. Months after the cabin had been abandoned, more bones surfaced in shallow graves, unearthed by farmers' plows, scattered by wolves. Each skull was another scream rising from the soil, another demand for reckoning. The prairie seemed endless, but in every whisper of wind, every rattle of grass, there was the echo of the dead. The hunt dragged on, and the men who rode it grew weary. Faces once fierce with rage now sagged with exhaustion, but they would not stop. They could not. For to return home without blood was to return defeated, to admit that the killers still walked free, shadows among the living. But the prairie remained silent. The trails faded. Wagon tracks dissolved into mud. And in that silence a terror deeper than death took root, that the benders had not been caught, that they had slipped into the veins of America itself, ready to rise again wherever the land grew hungry. The torches sputtered in the wind. The horses trembled, and far beyond the reach of light something or someone watched. The Bender cabin did not burn. It should have. Men spoke of setting fire to its timbers, of watching its crooked frame collapse into ash and smoke. Yet the house remained, hunched against the horizon like a wound that refused to close. And in its survival it became something worse than ruin. It became a shrine to dread. Travelers avoided it, veering miles out of their way to escape its shadow. Still, curiosity drew the bold or the foolish to its door. What they found inside was silence, a silence that pressed against the chest until breath itself felt unwelcome. The table still stood, one chair against the curtain, waiting like a stage for the ritual to resume. The trapdoor yawned dark and hungry, its hinges groaning when lifted, the pit beneath as foul as memory. Some claimed the air still smelled of rot, that no storm nor season could wash away the iron tang of blood. Those who lingered swore they heard whispers, voices curling from the floorboards, rising from the pit. Men's cries, women's sobs, the high, piercing wail of a child. At night, when the lanterns of distant farms burned faint, some said they saw a glow in the cabin window, flickering as though the benders had returned to their supper table. Others claimed to see Kate's face, pale, sharp, eyes gleaming with hunger, staring from the orchard, her lips moving as though she were still preaching to the spirits that had betrayed her. The orchard itself bore the stain of their sins. No fruit ripened on its trees again. Their branches twisted skyward like gnarled fingers, bark split and blackened, leaves withering long before the frost. Roots swelled thick, tangled, nourished by marrow and decay. Farmers whispered that if you stood among the trees on a moonless night, you could hear the soil breathing, the muffled groans of those who had been buried shallow, still clawing against the weight of earth. The legend grew. Children dared one another to approach the cabin, to touch its walls, to open its door. Some returned pale and silent, unwilling to speak of what they'd seen. Others never entered, claiming that as they drew close, the wind carried a chorus of whispers that drove them back. Preachers declared the ground cursed, a wound upon the land that no prayer could heal. And still the house stood, as though mocking every attempt to erase it. Years passed, but justice never came. Rumors multiplied that vigilantes had caught and slaughtered the family in secret, burying them in unmarked graves, that they had fled across the plains and lived under false names, their hunger continuing in other places, hidden behind new faces. The truth dissolved, but the curse remained. The land itself seemed to recoil, as if it knew evil had made a home there. The cabin sagged deeper with time, its roof bowing, its timbers splitting. Yet even as it decayed, its presence did not fade. It became a monument of unease, a whisper in the prairie wind, a reminder that some sins do not die with the flesh. And on certain nights, when the storm clouds pressed low and the earth trembled, those who dared to pass swore the lantern within still burned. Its light flickered against the window, waiting, calling, promising supper for the lost. Time is merciless on the prairie. Winds strip the land bare, storms gnaw at the earth, and wood splinters into dust. Yet though decades passed, the legend of the Benders did not wither with the cabin's bones. What had once been a home became ruin, its roof sagging into itself, its walls leaning like a drunkard ready to collapse. Grass swallowed the yard, dust pressed into every crack, and the orchard stood barren, twisted trees that seemed more like gallows than bearers of fruit. Yet even in ruin, the land whispered. Even in silence, the earth remembered. Farmers who worked the soil near the site unearthed fragments the prairie refused to keep buried. A cracked skull, a rusted knife, a lock of hair matted with clay. Each plow stroke was a resurrection, a voice rising from the grave. Some tried to ignore these discoveries, to rebury the past with hurried hands, but the bones returned, stubborn as memory. It was as though the land itself demanded remembrance, forcing each generation to reckon with the sins seeded into its soil. The Benders